Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be covering the disassembly, cleaning, and oiling process of this commercial electric 20-inch high-velocity floor fan. Now this is a very popular fan. It's sold actually at multiple stores. The commercial electric brand name is sold at the Home Depot, but this exact same fan is also sold at Walmart under the Mainstays brand name, sold with the Utilitech brand name at Lowe's, and here in Canada it's sold under the Mastercraft brand name at Canadian Tire. And maybe other brand names as well, but those are the popular ones that I'm aware of. And the problem with these fans is that they're often shipped with very poorly lubricated bearings. And oftentimes when you run the fan, you'll hear a very scratchy, unpleasant noise from the motor, which is dry bearings. And sometimes you'll hear squealing or other strange noises from the motor, and sometimes you might notice that the motor comes to a stop rather quickly when you turn the power off, and that's all an indication that you need to re-lubricate the bearings. And the best way to do that is to disassemble the fan, and in this video I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. First, make sure the fan is unplugged, and lie it down on its back on a tabletop. There are 6 screws holding the front grille onto the back grille, and they are located around the circumference of the fan. And to remove them, you will need a Phillips head screwdriver. Now, oftentimes these screws will be very stubborn and they will not budge when you try to use a manual screwdriver. If that's the case, do not force them, do not strip them out, because then you will not be able to take the fan apart. So, a little trick that I like to use, a pair of vice grips, clamp them around the handle of your screwdriver. Use your one hand to push the screwdriver into the screw firmly. So you're applying a lot of downward pressure. Use your other hand to support the fan, and use your forearm to turn the handle of the vice grips. Now this applies a tremendous amount of torque to the screw. This one wasn't too bad, but it will often help the screw break free. Now if you have a power tool, you can use that to remove them quickly, but just be careful not to ding up the paint or anything like that, because there's a risk of that happening. So now, you can undo the screw. So if you're just looking to clean the fan, then this is all you need to do in terms of disassembly. You can clean the blades using a damp cloth or a Swiffer duster or something like that. Clean all the vents with a vacuum cleaner or an air compressor, get all the dust out both front and back. You can reassemble the fan and you're good to go. But of course I want to show you guys how to oil the fan, which is the big focus of this video, so we're going to continue and show you how to do that. So now we're going to take the blades off. There's a single grub screw here that takes a 3mm Allen key. So insert that in there, undo the grub screw. Oh wow. That was on there very tightly, but we broke that free. Now you don't have to back these out all the way, just loosen it enough that it's going to let go of the shaft. And out it comes. Next up, we've got these 4 nuts holding the motor onto the back grille, and you will need either an adjustable wrench or a 10mm driver to undo these. Once they are removed, you can simply lift carefully the back grille away from the entire motor unit. Next thing you want to do is take this screw off of this ground wire. This is a Phillips head, Phillips number 2 head. And remember, these have little washers and lock washers there, so keep track of them, do not lose them. Flipping this motor unit around to the back, you will see 4 flange nuts holding the motor to this plastic housing. So you want to hold this steady. This nut right here is part of this screw stud, so don't try to take this off. This is machined as part of the screw. So simply hold this steady and undo these 8mm nuts. Next, you want to take these 3 Phillips head screws out to take this plastic switch housing off. So at this point, the motor is partially free from the plastic housing, but the most important part is to take this nuddle housing off of the stator so you can access the rotor inside and take the motor itself apart. Now to do that, there's a little hidden nut right here that's normally tucked away underneath the housing that you need to undo. Chances are when you were undoing the little flange nuts in the back, these just kind of came loose automatically, so basically just undo these. You can either do it by hand if they're already loose, or hold them down with an adjustable wrench and drive these out with the same 8mm hex socket. I usually like to put them back in the screws like that to keep track of them. So we're now pretty much ready to dive into the guts of the motor. Now before we take this housing off, make sure the shaft is perfectly clean and free of any burrs or indents, because that could potentially scratch the bearing, and that's very important. Now out of the factory there should not be any burrs to speak of, but just make sure that there isn't any. And one way you can tell is by just trying to remove the housing. So basically this top housing will slide off, and as you're lifting it off of the rotor here, if you encounter any resistance, do not force it. That's a sign that there is a raised area on the shaft, and what you want to do is take a fine sandpaper or a file and gently take that burr down, because you do not want to destroy the bearing, and that's something you absolutely do not want to do on a sleeve bearing motor. So that came off with 0 resistance. That's exactly what you want. So this is the front housing off, and we're going to keep track of its orientation because the ground wire is right there. Set this aside right here, and this rotating bit here is the rotor. This can lift out just quite easily. Just be careful not to strike the windings as you're doing that. So we're going to twist it and gently pull it out. There's a little bit of a suction because the back bearing is sealed, but there is the rotor. We'll set this aside as well. So here's a look at the motor. The stator looks good. The windings are nicely manufactured and tied. Now there in the center, and also on this side, is the sleeve bearing. You can see that there's a porous sintered bronze material that make up the bearing, or the bushing rather. And there's also, you might notice, some kind of a gooey felt material stuffed in there. Now do not remove them. They are oil wicks that are saturated with oil, and over time it's supposed to dispense the oil to the rotor as it spins, but from the factory, especially with a lot of newer fans, they just don't add enough lubrication. That of course leads to premature failure. So we're going to add our own oil to rejuvenate it. So the first step to take before you even apply new oil to the bearings is to clean them. You want to take all of the old oil residue out to make sure that they don't mix with the new oil. You can take some shop towel or paper towel. Now if the oil in there is really like blackened and gummy, you can take some WD-40 to wipe those clean. But this is a brand new fan. I only unboxed this like a few weeks ago, so the shaft is clean, but we're doing it just for the video. So you can take a piece of shop towel like I'm doing here, roll it up into a little cylinder, and then push it into the bearing there. I'll demonstrate it on this one because it's a little easier to see. So carefully insert it and just twist it And this will grab all of the old oil out of the bearing surface. Twist it like that. You can see a little bit of old oil just kind of all over the shop towel there. Clean the mating surface around here as well. So it's nice and clean. You just do one more thorough job of getting all of the old oil out of the bearing. So that's clean. And throw this out. Use a new piece and do the very same with the back bearing. Now it's kind of hard to see, but just reach in there, twist it into the bearing. Clean the little mating surface there. Clean the bushing once again. By the way, bushing and bearing is interchangeable in this case. So look at the old oil there. Take another piece, and this time clean the rotor. Just kind of spin it. Again, if it's really dirty here, use some WD-40. You can see the old oil starting to come off on the shop towel. Look at that. Alright, so we are now ready for oiling. Alright, so let's talk about the oil. The number one question that I get asked all the time is, what oil should I use in my fans? Well, here are my two recommendations based on my experience and what other fan collectors like to use, but this is not a sponsored video. This is the 3-in-1 electric motor oil sold in the blue and white bottle. I would highly advise against using the black and white bottle 3-in-1 oil because that is more of a general purpose household oil and it's not really formulated to handle the high-speed loads of an electric motor. Second one here, it is actually my favorite one. I would actually recommend this more than this 3-in-1. It is the ZoomSpout all-purpose turbine oil. This stuff is great. It has great film strength and it just seems to last a lot longer than the 3-in-1 in my experience. This also has better film strength, less of an annoying smell. It's a clear liquid. So all around this is a better oil. This one's sold under the Subco brand name, but these are also commonly found under many different brand names. It's the same formula, just different labels that are on there. So let's get oiling. I'm going to use ZoomSpout on this fan. Alright, so what you want to do is saturate the oil wicks in there with the new oil and also apply some to the bushing itself, bearing, bushing, same thing in this case, and let the porous material soak in some of the oil. So I'm going to take the ZoomSpout oil, make sure this is in the frame. I'm going to squeeze some oil into the wick material. Now you want to put enough that it's going to soak up a lot of the oil, but you do not want to over oil because then it's going to leak out when the fan's running and make a mess. Apply some directly to the bushing. Got some in there, just kind of turn it around to spread it evenly. You can let this sit here while you get to the other side of the motor. Same procedure, just oil the felt. And oil the bushing itself. Alright, so after I oiled the bearings, I let them sit for a few minutes, and then I noticed that the porous material had soaked up some of the oil, so I added a few new drops to it, and we are ready for reassembly. So now we're going to apply some oil to the rotor. Now just apply a little bit of oil to the surfaces that are going to be in contact with the bearing, so here, and a little bit along here. Do not oil this surface or here, that's completely unnecessary. It's going to sling the oil all over the inside of the motor. So take some oil, apply it to this surface, We're first going to drop it into the motor here. Oh. Now there's going to be a little bit of a pressure here because, again, the back bearing is sealed. So let it just kind of spin and kind of push down, coax it in. There, it'll just seat like that. And already that's a lot smoother. Same procedure. Apply some oil on the shaft here. And making sure the ground wire pin here is aligned, we're going to drop this housing back in like that. Alright, so we are now going to reassemble the motor, and it's pretty much the same as the disassembly, just in reverse, but I'll cover it anyways. So take this stud and screw and nut assembly, slide it in there, make sure the nut thread's on, and basically you want to hold the bottom of the nut steady while you tighten the top. Now I would not recommend using a power tool to tighten this because it could be a little bit excessive, unless you have a drill driver with a clutch, which I actually do, but it's not here with me. It's in my workshop. Kind of too lazy to get it, so I'm going to use my just trusty screwdriver. Tighten it. Now these don't need to be cranked down like crazy, just snug them up until they just won't turn, and give it a firm twist to lock them in place. That's all you need to do. And I like to go in like a cross pattern, so go to the opposite screw hole here, undo this, and rinse and repeat for all four. Alright, so after you reassemble the motor, you might notice that the shaft is very stiff or sometimes completely locked up. And that is very normal with sleeve-bearing motors. And the reason for that is the bushing inside is mounted inside of a socket, and they're free to pivot a little bit, but generally they're quite stiff, and even though they're called self-aligning bearings, you need to kind of help them out a little bit. So what you need to do is very simple. Take the back of the screwdriver and then give them firm taps from various angles. Give the shaft a spin. Much better already. Do it again. Spin it again. Sometimes I like to tap it down a little bit. So make sure you're giving firm taps on the shaft, but don't whack the crap out of them, because if you do it technically hard enough, it could potentially dislodge the bearing from the retainer, which you don't want. So this will be perfectly fine. Nothing will damage the bearings, and you can see here, it's free to spin. Now it's normal when you first assemble the fan after oiling that you'll hear a little bit of what seems like a dry bearing sound. That kind of hissing sound, but that is completely normal. Usually over time, as you run the fan, the oil will kind of work its way into the bushing. The surfaces will kind of break in again, and they will be completely silent. Alright, let's continue with the reassembly. Following our steps back from the disassembly process, you're going to flip these around. Take your little flange nuts. Now these bigger ones are meant to hold the motor to the back grille, so don't get them mixed up. Thread them in. And again, I'm going to take the screwdriver and hand tighten it. Now with these, you do not want to tighten them like crazy, because this is a plastic housing, and excessive force on that screw will crack it. And that is not what you want to do, so just be careful. So tighten until they're snug. And while you're here, you can just make sure the wiring is all good. Make sure there's no bare copper showing. There's the big capacitor. 10 microfarads. And there's the switch inside of there. And everything looks good, so we're going to put the plastic cover back. Now the reason why we took this off was just to give us a little bit of extra maneuverability when we were taking it apart. So make sure everything is tucked in nicely, nothing's getting pinched. Let's reattach the ground wire to the motor housing. Now there's an assortment of washers here. The first one that goes on here is the serrated one, then the ground wire, and there's a flat washer and a lock washer. They thread into the motor housing directly, and I'm going to use my screwdriver to tighten this. Make sure the wire is not too strained in any way. Snug it up, and it's all good. We're now going to bring back our rear grille assembly, making sure the motor is in this upright position like this. We are going to lower the back grille over the motor like so, making sure these studs are lined up with these mounting bracket areas. Make sure the wire is not getting pinched. The ground wire here is kind of in a tricky spot, so it might get pinched, but just make sure it's not getting crushed because that is problematic. Alright, and bring out your big flange nuts. Thread these on. Remember, these are 10mm flange nuts. And then we're going to tighten them up by hand, or a clutched drill driver if you have one, and get these snugged up. So after you tighten these fasteners, you might notice that the motor shaft is stiff again, but that is completely normal. It's because these nuts are applying additional force, and that could kind of alter the alignment again. So do the same procedure and do that a few times. Turn the shaft around, spin it, rinse and repeat. This one's all good, so we're going to proceed with attaching the blades. Ensure that the spot here is perfectly lined up with the grub screw. Slide it down. You can actually see the flat spot there. Take your Allen key. We're going to raise that and crank the grub screw down all the way. You want these to be really tight because you don't want the blades to fly off, but don't tighten them to a point where you're going to break the grub screw. And once you've tightened these screws, the repair is complete. The fan is now ready to go and ready to provide service for many months and years, depending on how often you use it. Obviously keep the fan clean and once in a while oil the motor, and it should be good for many years. Alright, let's test it out. Good as new. Now again, it is normal for the bearings to have a little bit of a sound when you first reassemble it after oiling, but I guarantee you if you did it properly, eventually this will kind of fade away as everything kind of breaks and settles down once again. Alright, well that concludes this video on how to service a commercial electric 20-inch high-velocity floor fan. Or really, this video could apply to any other high-velocity fans in this style, regardless of the manufacturer. So hopefully this video was informative, helpful, enjoyable, all that. So that's going to be it for this one. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace!